Assalamualaikum, second year. Today we will start with the central neural pathway for hearing. It is the afferent auditory pathway which is responsible for conveying the signals starting right from the hair cell all the way to cortex. Right. So the fibers of auditory pathway they pass through the cochlear division of vestibulocochlear nerve, which is your eighth cranial nerve. This division is also called auditory nerve. Now, major part of the auditory pathway it lies in uh, three structures of brain, which are medulla oblongata, midbrain, and the thalamic region. While the higher center for final termination of fibers that is located in the temporal lobe of cerebral cortex. Now keep in mind that each cochlea that is represented in the cortex on both sides because the auditory cortex it receives both crossed and uncrossed fibers from each cochlea. Both inner and outer hair cells of cochlea are the receptors for the auditory pathway. These cells they are innervated by afferent and efferent nerve fibers. So the afferent fibers, the sensory fibers, they form the auditory nerve. I already told you that 90 to 95% of cochlear nerve fibers they innervate inner hair cells, and the remaining 5 to 10% of the afferent nerve fibers they innervate outer hair cells. Now the nerve endings around hair cells they are dendritic neurites. Uh, and the cell bodies they are present in the spiral ganglion in the modulus. Here the cell bodies lie. Now the cells of the spiral ganglion they are actually bipolar cells, and these bipolar cells they form the first order neurons of auditory pathway. The axons of these bipolar cells they form the cochlear nerve fibers, and the frequency of action potentials in a single auditory nerve fiber that is proportional to the loudness of sound. Now focus on this figure where you can see that the sensory fibers from the spiral ganglion they enter the brainstem, and immediately after entering the medulla oblongata the fibers they divide into two groups which terminate in the cochlear nuclei, the dorsal cochlear nuclei and the ventral cochlear nuclei. And these are the cochlear nuclei of the same side. Now, the neurons of cochlear nuclei they form the second order neurons of pathway. Here, the second order neurons they lie. Now, the axons of second order neurons they pass through a complex pathway because it runs in four different directions. So, what happens that now what are these four directions? They cross the midline and they reach the opposite side trapezoid body and then to the superior olivary complex here. And this group of the fibers that forms the main auditory pathway. The other pathways are like the axons of the second order neuron. They terminate at the superior olivary complex of the same side via ipsilateral trapezoid body. Then there is another group which reach the lateral lemniscus on same side in its nucleus. And finally, there is another group which reach the reticular formation. It crosses the midline and it joins the nucleus of opposite lateral lemniscus. Here you can see the nuclei of lateral lemnisci. This is the ipsilateral nucleus and this is the contralateral nucleus. Next, you see that these signals they reach the superior olivary nucleus on the contralateral side and also on the ipsilateral side. And then the fibers they enter the lateral lemniscus here. Now, the neurons in this superior olivary complex and the nucleus of the lateral lemniscus they form the third order neurons of the auditory pathway. So, first order neurons they were present in the modulus in the spiral ganglion. The second order neurons they are present in the cochlear nuclei and the third order neurons they are present in the superior olivary complex and the nuclei of lateral lemnisci. Now the fibers of third order neuron they end in the medial geniculate body which forms the subcortical auditory center. There are some fibers which terminate in the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate body. And then the fibers from the medial geniculate nucleus they go to the temporal cortex via the internal capsule as the auditory radiations. So the final destination that is the primary auditory cortex which is also called area 41. So starting from here because here lie the third order neuron, I repeat again that the fibers of the third order neuron they end in the medial geniculate body and this medial geniculate body or nucleus that is forming the subcortical auditory center. And there are then some fibers which terminate in the inferior colliculi, and then they go to the medial geniculate body. And from there, from the medial geniculate body, the fibers they finally go to the temporal cortex as the auditory radiations. So that is the flow chart of the auditory pathway. You can see that the spectral analysis of the sound that starts in the cochlear nuclei, while the directional analysis that starts at superior olivary complex, and final integration of this spectral and spatial analysis that takes place at the level of inferior colliculi. Mm, There are some important consideration which you need to learn about the auditory pathway, that the signals from both ears they are transmitted through pathways of both sides of brain, but with the preponderance of transmission in the contralateral side. In the brainstem, the crossing over between these pathways that occurs at least three sites, and those three sites they are the trapezoid body, then the in the commissure between two nuclei of lateral lemnisci, and then the commissure which is connecting two inferior colliculi. Some of the fibers of auditory radiation they do not reach the primary auditory cortex, but they go to the auditory association areas which is called the area 42. Now these fibers they arise from the thalamic association area which is adjacent to the medial geniculate body. Now sleep and sound ring a bell? There is a route to the auditory cerebral cortex which ascends via reticular formation of the brainstem. Now, the reticular activating system that receives collateral fibers from the auditory tracts, and this system it projects diffusely upward in the brainstem and downwards in the spinal cord. uh, why these collateral fibers they are important? Because this collateral pathway it activates the entire nervous system in response to the loud sound. Now, you must know that how sudden noise that is perceived. This perception is mediated by the collateral signals to the vermis of cerebellum. See, this vermis of cerebellum, it receives some fibers from three structures of the auditory pathway. That those are cochlear nuclei, inferior colliculi, and the auditory areas of the cerebral cortex. You already know what function outer hair cells they perform in the process of hearing. But now I'm going to tell you that how the functioning of these cells that is regulated. The olivocochlear bundle, it originates in the superior olivary nucleus, and that constitutes the efferent pathway which terminate on the outer hair cells. Now, this efferent pathway, it gives a mechanism by which the cerebral cortex it controls the input of outer hair cells to the cerebral cortex. Hmm. Now we will see that if there is any synchronization between the firing rate and the frequency of sound. You see, single nerve fibers which enter the cochlear nuclei from the auditory nerve, they can fire at the rate of 1000 per second. This rate is determined mainly by the loudness of the sound. At sound frequencies up to 2000 to 4000 cycles per second, the auditory nerve impulses they are synchronized with the sound waves. In auditory tracts of brain stem, the firing rate that is no longer synchronized with frequency except below 200 cycles per second. And above the level of inferior colliculi, the this low frequency synchronization that is also lost. Now, I will tell you about the pit stops the auditory fibers they make on their way to the final destination. And these stops, they are at the levels of cochlear nuclei, uh, superior olivary complex, nuclei of lateral lemnisci, and inferior colliculi, then come medial geniculate bodies, and finally the auditory cortex. Now I will bombard you with info about these one by one. So let's start with the cochlear nucleus. Um, this cochlear nucleus it forms a prominent bulge in the lateral surface of the brainstem, and it has got two parts, the dorsal and the ventral part, and they have their own different functions. The dorsal part, it has the tonotopical organization with low frequencies ventrolaterally and the high frequencies dorsomedially. Now, what does the ventral part do? The ventral part that is concerned with the sound localization and encoding the sound intensity and frequency. All right. Then comes the superior olivary complex, and that is present in the caudal aspect of pons. And keep in mind that it is the first central auditory center to receive binaural innervation. Then, what does it do? It helps in sound localization using two things, interaural time delay and interaural intensity difference. And then the superior olivary complex, it also helps in sound detection and compound sound processing. Next is the lateral lemniscus. Um, what is it? It is a band by which the medullary and the pontine auditory nerve fibers they reach to the inferior colliculus. And what is the function? It helps in sound localization and processing. And it also forms a component of acoustic startle reflex pathway. Now, it has got two parts, ventral and dorsal. And both parts they receive differential innervation from ipsilateral and contralateral cochlear nucleus and the superior olivary complex. Right. So moving on to inferior colliculus, which is present in midbrain. Uh, the inferior colliculus it helps in sound localization, frequency determination, and the integration of auditory with the non-auditory system. Now I'm going to give you more detail, and it is totally up to you if you want to learn in such detail. But I have to tell you that this inferior colliculus it has three parts: uh, central and paracentral nucleus, and the cortical area. Uh, you see the central nucleus. It gives projections and it receives directly and indirectly from one ear or from both the ears. Now, this nucleus that is layered into isofrequency bands. What does this mean? Uh, Actually, what happens that along each band, these cells they have same dendritic fields and they respond best to approximately same frequency. And the higher frequency that lie in the midline, and the lower frequencies they are toward outside. So this is how they produce tonotopic maps. Now, what about the cortical area? The cortical area it gives projections to primary and secondary auditory cortex through the medial geniculate body. So, the medial geniculate body that is present in thalamus, and this also has got three parts: ventral, dorsal, and medial. The ventral part, it has three subnuclei, and dorsal part has 10 subnuclei. Mm, Now the this ventral part, it gives projections to the auditory cortex, and it helps in tonotopic organization. Dorsal and medial, they have both auditory and non-auditory connections. And what is their function? They play a role in arousal, which is actually attending the auditory stimuli. Right. So here we reach the final destination. So we will see that where it is located and to where it extends, and you will have to memorize that. The auditory cortex, it lies in the supratemporal plane of superior temporal gyrus, and it also extends onto the lateral side of the temporal lobe. And that part is called the insular cortex and the parietal operculum. So that was the route your auditory pathway takes. Next time we will look into finer ramifications of this pathway and its abnormalities. That's all for now.